Okay, so this talk is partly my own memories from the 1960s and partly a brief history of an organisation that I was involved in then, which is called the Syndicalist Workers Federation. We have somebody in the audience who was also involved in that organisation in the 1960s. So, few things can compare with the pleasure of running, aged 17, in rage down Whitehall with a black flag. It should have been a black and red flag, but somebody gave it to me, so it was a black flag. And on the 1963 Aldermaston, this connects with the previous talk, march, a group calling themselves Spies for Peace left the main march, much against the wishes of the CNT leadership, to demonstrate at the regional seat of government's bunker outside Reading. And later, when the march reached London, there were disorderly demonstrations in which anarchists were prominent. That's from Wikipedia. So there'd been the excitement of challenging Peggy Duff in the campaign for nuclear disarmament on the second day of the CNT march, going to the uninspiring and bizarrely, when I got there, unguarded bunker of the regional seat of government. But on the march, we sang, don't you hear the, I'm not going to sing, don't you hear the H-bomb's thunder echo like the crack of doom? And we sang, I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. So anarchists in 1965 tried to repeat the disorderliness of 1963 and tried to be at the head of the march. So I remember the dragon dance of the march forming in Hyde Park, and the anarchist flags and banners on a rise, and we seized the front. And we ambled along slightly footsore, and I noticed that the police ranks alongside us began to thicken. And as we approached Parliament Square, the police encircled us, linked arms, and violently pushed us off the road. I was 17 and shocked as the policeman raised his thigh hard between my legs. This kettling predated the use of the concept by more than 40 years. I'm sure they'd done it before then as well. But they've always done this, just as the reformists have always apologised for the police actions. Peace News, the CNT newspaper editorial about this event, put it like this: one wonders what anarchists expect to achieve by their obstructive activities. On Saturday and Sunday, their organised attempts at leading and blocking the Easter March have no apparent point to them, but were fairly easily overcome. On Easter Monday, they seemed equally pointless, but were more effective. They were a considerable nuisance. So the anarchist current within the peace movement has all been opposed by the people at the head of things like CNT. But sadly, two comrades from Freedom Press in the letter columns of Peace News piously joined in the criticism. Anarchism has nothing to do with running about with red and black flags or fighting and running away from the police. It's a way of living, acting and resisting sensibly and sanely. Therefore, we wish to disassociate ourselves from the antics of these once-a-year anarchists. Well, I know which current of anarchism I have more sympathy with. But there was also a letter in Peace News which concurred with my memory. And it's interesting because I thought maybe I made this up until I read this letter in Peace News kind of a few months ago. The police had a free hand, it seemed, to break the march into minute fragments, to harass and obstruct without demur from the orthodoxy. Indeed, it was plainly obvious that the police and the official marshals were cooperating closely together. As ever, the reformist leaders cooperate with police oppression. Your leader-writer cannot have been with the anarchists on Easter Monday. If he had been, he would have seen the fact that there was a far greater concentration of police here than all the rest of the march put together. The final idiocy came near Parliament Square. A police cordon very roughly held 1,000 or so anarchists back, pushing them together and inwards. We heard someone's arm was broken, and it was certainly an ugly mess. The CNT marshals then waved the rest of the march past, and they trooped by, good comrades one and all, and walked passively, three abreast up Whitehall. Of course, the anarchists broke the cordon and swarmed up both sides of Whitehall, which was my memory. And the following Easter was similar. And Direct Action, which was the Syndicalist Workers Federation paper, reported it thus: the refusal to allow a libertarian speaker enraged the large contingent, about 1,000 strong, behind the black and red banners at the forefront of the crowd. Skirmishing developed between the police and the front ranks, during which coppers' helmets flew high, and several banners, including those of the SWF and the Wandsworth Libertarians, were seized by the law. Well, how did I come to anarchism? My mother thought it would occupy a bored teenager to join the Labour Party Young Socialists. She thought it was a nice discussion circle or something. But I knew somehow at the end of 1962 that my life would utterly change. There they were, the men with the unusually long hair and beards, unusual at that time, the women in baggy jumpers and all wearing duffel coats. If anyone's seen the film Ginger and Rosie, it completely captures the aura of those days. So one of the early events I attended was a debate, workers' control or co-ownership, between the YS, the Young Socialists, and the Young Liberals. And with dramatic clarity I was convinced, there in a church hall in the deep snow of 1963, dressed, I remember, in a black polo net jumper, green box-flared skirt, black stockings, we didn't wear tights then, and chisel-toed shoes, I understood at a road to Damascus moment that capitalism could not be reformed away. I became a revolutionary. As a revolutionary and a supporter of the International Socialists, current within the Young Socialists, these were to later become the SWP, the International Socialists, I sold their paper Young Guard at school, and I had copies of it and my duffel coat confiscated. But the YS marched against the development, things like the development of more office blocks in London and for more housing. It's amazing how all the issues remain the same. And we also demonstrated against the visit of Queen Frederica of Greece. And I remember a small face surrounded by white mink in a Daimler outside Claridge's Hotel. And that was in July 1963. And in my mind's eye, there I am again, running through the London street, wearing a cape, on a day famous for a policeman called Challoner planting a brick in the anarchist Donald Room's pocket, for which later Challoner was charged with corruption. But I became uneasy in the IS. If we were revolutionaries, why were we members of the Labour Party? The Trotskyists had not convinced me about the value of entrism, working as a revolutionary inside a reformist party. But by 1964 and the Wilson government, I was no longer in the Labour Party at all. I went by bus across South London to meetings of the Surrey Anarchist group, buying, I can remember, a newspaper cone of chips for 6 old pence, i.e. about 2p, on the way back. But foregoing the chips one time, I accepted a lift home, the bus journey being long, from the evident special branch man who attended the meetings. He had, of course, short, neatly brushed hair, polished shoes, and a half-witted manner. In one discussion about education, he'd got his left group's briefings muddled up and kept going on about the real importance of state control of education. So he was obviously thinking he was talking to communists. And he would offer a different person a lift home every week, which we accepted until we got bored, and told him that the meetings were discontinued. And we told each other by word of mouth, never by phone or by letter, where they were. So there we are. 1964, I was a revolutionary, committed to the ideal of workers' control, an idea which led me in a syndicalist direction. So this is where I come into contact with the Syndicalist Workers Federation. They met at that time in the Lucas Arms pub in the Gray's Inn Road, a pub where the International Socialist Readers' Meetings had been, and where the SWP, I believe, continues to meet. I attended it initially with a boyfriend, but he soon went abroad to hitchhike to Afghanistan and back, so I went alone. The Lucas Arms was quite a heavy, serious drinking pub, and men downstairs would sometimes be hurled Wild West style across the saloon. And rather nervous, aged 17, with waist-length hair, baggy, grubby jumpers and coal-rimmed eyes, I mounted the stairs to the warm embrace of the anarcho-syndicalists. So, the Syndicalist Workers Federation was a syndicalist group active in post-war Britain, formed in, it's not clear whether it's 1948 or 1950. It decided to pursue a more definitely syndicalist workers' strategy from the outset, from the previous more general anarchist influence. emphasis of its predecessor group. The group joined the International Workers Association and, during the Franco era, gave particular support to the Spanish resistance and the underground CNT, anarcho-syndicalist union, which had previously been involved in the 1936 Spanish Revolution. I can't stress enough how significant Spain was to our generation of revolutions, particularly those on the libertarian left. It had the kind of significance that Vietnam was after a later generation. And as Albert Meltzer, the veteran anarchist, described the Syndicalist Workers Federation, at one time it had a fair number of adherents and participated in many struggles, particularly those of the dockers. And it was also active in the National Union of Seamen, including, I gather from the newspapers, in the Bristol Channel Seafarers Liaison Committee. And it'd be interesting to find out more about them from the Bristol end, and the 1966 Seamen's strike. Harold Wilson denounced, to our pleasure, denounced the Seamen's strike as being led by a tightly knit group of politically motivated men. I'm not sure that they were all syndicalists, but they were all far left. One of the founding members of the SWF, Tom Brown, had been an engineering apprentice in the Northeast, and Mark told me Tom remembered seeing a newsreel at the cinema which had footage of a train in America, a long line of boxcars, on one of which was written in large letters, the whole height of the boxcar, "Strike in Oregon, Wobblies wanted." And so that connection with the American Wobblies, which I'll say more about in a minute, was there from the beginning. In the 1930s, Tom Brown was in and out of the Communist Party, and in the time of Spain, he and others left the Communist Party in disgust. And the anarchists produced a paper called Spain and the World. But at the outbreak of the Second World War, this paper was renamed War Commentary. And War Commentary was, I did a PhD on the Second World War. War Commentary was absolutely the best left paper of the war period. And according to Mark, there was a bust-up at the end of the war on the editorial board of War Commentary. There was a decision that it would be politically safer to have the press owned in the name of the individual, in case the state closed down the organisation. I presume Vernon Richards is no longer with us. Yes, I'll carry on. It was put in the name of Vernon Richards, who then stood on his bourgeois property rights, along with the majority of the London anarchist group. And they continued to produce War Commentary, which became Freedom. Those who left formed the Anarchist Federation of Britain in 1944 and 5, and began to produce the paper Direct Action, then changed their name to Syndicalist Workers Federation, as I've described. So I sold the paper Direct Action. It was actually rather a boring paper, but it's good, reasonable politics. There were various people. There's somebody called Don Padelti, is that how you say it? Who still lives in the Wye Valley, who was active at that time, and there was a very important person called Ken Hawkes, who was an avuncular figure in a Gabardine Mac, who were very active. But the SWF described itself thus: we advocate the formation of revolutionary industrial unions, or syndicates, with syndicates for one syndicate for each industry, all linked in a national confederation of labour. We would have an organisation which would carry out all the necessary functions of a civilised society. The state, which is the enforcement agency of the capitalist class, would be abolished, along with the capitalists. This is in Direct Action, in January 1964. It's just sort of lovely that you idea. You could, we'll just abolish the state and we'll abolish the capitalists. It's kind of, unfortunately, it would be more difficult than that. But Tom Brown put it thus: in the Revolutionary Industrial Union or Syndicate, there must be room for every person who is not a delegate of the boss, who plays a part in the production of that industry or service. Tradesman, labourer, clerk, scientist. Black socks, red socks or no socks. One in, all in. And that's in a pamphlet called Who Are the Workers? Or an article called Who Are the Workers in Direct Action, February 1964. So the SWF held discussion meetings, initially in the Farringdon Road, then in the Grayson Road. And for example, in 1964, the adverts described February the 5th, workers' control or workers' management. February the 12th, political and labour development in Israel. That's interesting. February the 19th, print workers struggle for unity. February the 26th, industrial action against the bomb with the veteran Pat Arrowsmith. And then, rather sweetly, and I don't know if I went to this, on March the 4th, there was a recital of revolutionary and folk records. Remember this kind of time? Not every, I think there are some seats. There's a seat here, there's some seats here. Pause for a moment, I need to find a seat. Maureen? Oh. So you didn't have, you might have a dance set record player, but you wouldn't have your own music as much. So that's important to go to sit in a room and have people play records of revolutionary folk music. And then on March the 25th, anti-parliamentary action and the general election. In 1964, it held its 6th national conference, attended by 50 comrades, and Direct Action at that time had a circulation of 400 copies. And the report was it had 500 members about that time. And the conference reported progress despite the setbacks of the arrest of Stuart Christie, which I'm going to come on to, in Spain, and the theft of its stock of printing type. Actually, you can't exaggerate. In those days, losing your printing type, and who was it stolen? Is absolutely devastating. You can't produce your newspaper. Direct Action reported on action in many industrial arenas. I've mentioned some, but there were the printers, bus workers, right-wing ballot rigging in the electricians' unions, and other struggles, such as workers in a bra factory who were sacked for joining a union. But it also, I remembered, and the pages of Direct Action make clear, was involved in other arenas of struggle outside the workplace, though the name and the ethos of the organisation seemed to suggest that the issue is the point of production. It did actually engage in support of struggle outside the workplace. And again, the issues are nearly always all the same. So it was engaged in direct action in support of gypsies to physically protect common ground, which was being barricaded against gypsies. And it worked with homeless women and children who were herded into hostels where the fathers or male partners couldn't join them. So it engaged in direct action about that. But what I particularly remember myself is in the mid-60s, I remember a talk analysing the background of the 1964 Labour government. And I remember statistics being written up on a blackboard with chalk, and this stuff, and it showed the high percentage of public schoolboys in this pre-Blair period. I think people later kind of assumed that it's Blairite Labourism, it's all public schoolboys, but this is a 1964 Labour government, high percentage of public schoolboys. But what was particularly interesting was the connection with the IWW and the IWA. So there was the connection with the American Wobblies and with Spain. There was an American hobo who was a member, Ralph Rosenbaum. He was a genuine Wobbly, and he talked about riding the rails, the thing that Tom Brown had seen. They would get into the boxcars and go from town to town, or with union organising and singing Joe Hill songs. But now in the mid-60s, he slept on the Thames embankment. And I remember him saying he had newspapers down his plaid shirt against the cold. And I keep on, when I see people homeless in the street, people want to go up and say, why don't you put some newspapers down your shirt, because it's quite good against the cold. But I realise that's not really a bit of a reformist intervention. But I remember his talk, which I see from Direct Action, was on January the 22nd, 1965, Depression years in the USA, so I remember that talk. And he also wrote in the paper of an incident in San Francisco where a judge said, I don't feel the IWW are a real labour union. And the person before him said, well, if you don't feel the IWW is a real labour union, then I don't feel you are a real judge. But of course, this guy was held in contempt of court. But most of all, and most dramatically, I remember the connection with the Spanish exiles of the CNT. There was, you told me the name of Hortensia's mother, which I've forgotten again. I can't say it. Who she would interject randomly into the meeting Viva La Revolucion, Viva El CNT, and then we go on with what we were talking about. But there was also someone who seemed to me an apparently sweet little old man with an eye patch, and he sat in the corner. And somebody said, see Jose, he rode with the Durutti column, and they killed 30 priests in one afternoon. Mark disputes the figure, but that's what I remember somebody saying to me. And Jose smiled sweetly and patted my arm. So this real, why I came to want to give this talk was when I first came into the Hydra bookshop about 6-9 months ago. Somewhere on here there's a poster, a picture of Durutti. And so I said to Matt, who was in the bookshop at the time, I knew a man who rode with Durutti, and it's kind of like, I feel it's really important, you know, to pass on the fact you can touch my hand if you like. When the man who rode with Durutti patted. But Mark says that Jose wasn't sweet at all, and at one meeting in London, which the Spanish Phalangists attacked, he saw them off very securely. Albert Meltzer, interesting, is critical in his book of his own decision not to throw in his lot with the Syndicalist Workers Federation, and that was mainly because of the Syndicalist Workers Federation Association, he thinks, with one wing, the Spanish CNT, in exile, because there's a lot of rivenness within the exiles. And one of the Spaniards was Agustin Roa, who had narrowly escaped the death squads in May 1937 in Barcelona, and also Joaquin Perez, a member of the Friends of Durutti, who'd been sentenced to death by a Republican court in November 1938 for carrying a pistol in Barcelona, and was saved only bizarrely by when Franco captured the city and the prison guards ran away, leaving him and others able to escape. And there's also a split between those who joined the Republican government, such as Federica Monsegni, who some of us, I don't know if any of you here, saw the film that was shown the other week, Toda la Vida, about the women's organisation Mujeres Libres. My Spanish isn't any good. She's in that film. So the SWF was very strong in support of the Spaniards. For example, there were 11 Spaniards on death row in Madrid. And as Mark said, we organised a lot of direct action here. For example, against Iberian Airways. I said, oh, we just didn't use we throw bricks through the windows, and we threw a manhole cover through the window of Iberian Airways, much more effective. We also did quite a bit of telephone bombing, which is ringing up an airline to say there was a bomb on a plane. So, and you know, they take these things seriously. So the Iberian Airline had to turn back on its way out of Copenhagen. So Spain and the defeat of our side hung really heavy in our hearts. It seemed impossible that Franco would ever be defeated. There's a company that he would survive forever. And this was the context for Stuart Christie, who left the Lucas Arms in the Gray's Inn Road for Spain in July 1964, just before I arrived. He strapped a bomb to his body and tried to assassinate Franco. So we were no armchair revolutionaries. I don't think any of us were involved in this decision to do that. And certainly when he was arrested, we were all righteous indignation that he was entirely innocent. But as Roger just said earlier this afternoon, you know, we are actually with the guilty, the people who are engaged in action against our class enemies. But in response to his arrest, my boyfriend travelled from his home in Surbiton with a brick in a sugar bag in his donkey jacket pocket, being mindful of the Challoner case, and where the absence of brick dust in the pocket might have got him off. But he hurled the brick through the Spanish embassy window and was pursued by a policeman, caught, fined £86, which was a huge sum in 1964. But in 1965, I went to university. So it seems to be extraordinary now looking back. I was a schoolgirl almost doing all this. In 1965, I went to university as a lone anarchist. There were no other anarchists at the university. And I initially kept my connection with the SWF, but by 1970, I began my long travail with Trotskyism and drifted away from the anarchist movement. the Syndicalist Workers Federation did not survive the 1960s, but again a name change. It became the Direct Action Movement, which later became the Solidarity Federation. I hope some of the comrades from Salford are here now. But why did it wasn't just it changed its name, it actually declined, and my account of why it declined is, in a sense, there was a problem in the philosophical core of an anarcho-syndicalist organisation, privileging, in almost a classic, ironically in a classical Marxist sense, privileging the site of production as being the key arena for struggle. As the Solfed in their history put it, the emphasis on producers rather than the working class in a more general sense could be seen to treat work as the exclusive site of struggle, and thus exclude the unemployed, housewives and others. And of course it also excluded kind of battles around issues of race or sexual orientation, which there were not key issues in the 1960s. But at the same time, by the end of the 1960s, other revolutionaries from the Trotskyist kind were successfully running with arguments for workers' control and building large movements against both trade union officials and the Labourite social democracy. So there was a big current there which attracted people who were interested in those ideas. And at the same time, others coming out of the opposition to the Vietnam War were building large student movements at the same time as the women's movement were developing. So there was this other whole stuff going on which the SWF didn't really address. So Albert Meltzer puts it that the SWF, anarcho-syndicalist but choked by weeds of the neo-leftism surrounding it, disappeared as an organised body soon after Tom Brown's death. And I want to finish with a quote from Mark. Mark said that he was in the SWF because he saw it as a way of destroying civility and subservience. Human beings naturally want to live better lives, and Mark felt it was up to him to subvert or destroy attempts to prevent that. And I certainly was in the SWF because it was a revolutionary current interested in issues of workers' control and against labourism and state and so forth.
Fantastic. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions there. Can I just put the hat around? I think we've got a slightly different audience really, just to keep our events going. Just for donations, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to plug something at this point because I'm also a member of the Sparrow's Nest Collective in Nottingham, which is an anarchist library and archive, and we've got the archives of the SWF in our possession from exactly the era you're talking about. So we got the archives from what was then the AFB from 44-45 when they were founded up to the mid-60s, and it's to a large extent digitized and can be accessed on via database on the internet. So we have got things like the foundation statement of the SWF dated from 1950, laying out the reasons why they ceased to be AFB, why they wanted to become the SWF. We've got, I think the stuff that found our way to us were the personal archives of Ken Hawkes at the time, because it's all the stuff that he collected when he was publication secretary in these 20 years. So I had to grin often because I've read many of the letters referring to the many of the things we're talking about. So there's a huge chunk of material regarding the Siemens strike and the magazine Siemens Voice. There's all the stuff about freedom, and the SWF, at least that's the kind of impression I got from reading the documents, hated each other vigorously, which I think was still based on the split from 44. So there's a lot more of freedom dissing stuff where SWF people were in, and yeah, and back in very, very, very rude words. There is so much more concerning the concerning the Spain solidarity. There is leaflets about meetings to support people on death row. There is letters from the CNT in exile alarming the SWFO. There's these 3 people being on trial in Madrid next week. Can you do some solidarity action? There's a letter from, one of my favorite letters was from 45 when Ken Hawkes and some others went to Trafalgar Square, where the infamous General Lister, who was part of the smashing of the agrarian collective in Asturias near the end of the Spanish Civil War, and he gave a speech in Trafalgar Square, and then the then AFB people went down there and started smashing up.
Can you repeat the name?
General Lister, or the other guy.
No, that one.
Oh yeah, General Lister, but I don't know his first name, and it may be
Enrique.
Ah, thank you.
He was later a general under Castro and went to Cuba.
Okay, so Enrique, what's the
Lister? I think it's just Lister.
Just like the.
Yeah, there's so much material, there's so much source material for what you just talked about. I've got a bunch of leaflets and cards, and so just go on our website. We just relaunched our digital library, so it looks a bit 1990s internet because none of us really good in web design, but it's essentially very, very long lists. You can search for keywords, you can search for times, and then just scanned. We also got like the complete or the almost complete run of Direct Action and World Labour News, but those are not digitized because we are too poor to buy a proper scanner. But yeah.
So have you got any theories as to the sort of missing generation of anarchists? It seems that you're obviously still keen and in there, and I mean, we've probably had conversations about this before, about other groups, whereas you've got 1 or 2 people that are still kind of fighting the corner, but it seems like a lot of people just sort of dropped it after the early 70s, and you know, why that might have been.
Well, there's the whole kind of after the early it's before Thatcher's children, isn't it? Because there's the whole kind of disappearance of the left. From the 80s, there's less of a left because people become Thatcher's children. But my only explanation is to do with the strength and success of various Trotskyist groups like the Socialist Workers Party and the International Marxist group, who were very involved in both the student struggle and the Vietnam stuff and in the industrial struggle. That's my only explanation.
I mean, there was, and I was in the Anarchist Workers Association in the 70s, and I joined it without any sort of understanding of the history and how it related to the syndicalist organisations that you were in. But that was quite a big organisation. It had branches all over the country. So there was anarchist organisations. They ended up joining in with Big Flame in the late 70s. And Big Flame were very, very strong in the car factories, particularly in Liverpool. That's where the Big Flame came out of. But it was kind of had a very strong sort of syndicalist kind of philosophy.
Mark, do you want to add anything?
You covered it pretty well.
Was that your hand again?
Yeah. Just wanted to ask again regarding one of your last points when you were saying that part of what you think part of the problem of the decline was that they put so much focus on work is only industrial work and people wielding big bits of metal and stuff. When you were in the organization, was that discussed internally? Was there any were there any discussions about what is work, who are we focusing on, or was it always more or less a given that as an organization you would focus on production?
Well, there's a quote from Tom Brown I talked about, which was red socks, black socks, and no socks. So it was anybody who was in work in any kind of a way, but that still doesn't answer the point about women's struggles or race struggles or any other issue. But there was this stuff about gypsies and about the homeless. So, but I don't remember anyone kind of going. So people instinctively supported other campaigns and like anti-war, anti-nuclear stuff. But I don't remember them being articulated. Well, hang on a minute. How does this fit with the philosophy? I don't remember that.
I remember saying to Ken Hawkes, industrial workers of the world. Does that mean industrial in organisation? In other words, where you worked and everybody all in one union. He said, "Oh no, that means industrial workers. You know, horny-handed sons of the engineering works. You know, people who thump big, like you say, thump big bits of metal." So perhaps there was a split there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about it. You were talking about the Falange attacking a meeting of the CNT here down in London.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So how big were they? The Falange, do you know?
This is something Mark told me about. Do you know about that?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
The Falange, the Spanish Falange, attacking one of the CNT meetings in London.
They were all very young people. I don't think they were. I mean, whereas the Spanish exiles tended to be. The anarchist exiles tended to be all generations because they'd come here and brought their children with them all bread. More little anarchists, Spanish anarchists here. But the phalangists I saw, apart from the ones who you might see going up and down the embassy steps, were young men, and I gather they just come here looking for work, and they just I think most of the young Spaniards were not very politicised. These would have been the more politicised ones, I think, who would have been more pro-government. The others would have probably kept their mouths shut. So I don't know. As for numbers, I've no idea. You did get the feeling that the Spanish movement was under surveillance, though.
Oh yeah.
I don't mean just by the British police, by the Spanish embassy and its agents as well.
Yeah, sure.
Because they wanted to know who was going to go into Spain and cause trouble, if for no other reason.
And the other thing I didn't mention that the SWF was very strong on, it was a very important campaign, was the boycott. People began to take holidays in Spain, and it was the boycotting Spanish. It was mainly boycotting Spanish holidays rather than Spanish food, and that was really important. That's why the airlines were really important. Yeah, food as well. The airlines were really important because people were beginning to take cheap flights to Spain.
I was just going to say the left were generally under surveillance, weren't they? Was it some publication listed in
Well,
in England, I'm talking about.
The surveillance of the left is kind of universal. It was addressed at Evelyn Lovers, who gave a talk last week, Secret Manoeuvres in the Dark, about the surveillance, about spies, corporate and police spies. There's also, just a little plug, on the 29th, there's a meeting at Tony Benn House about blacklisting, which I'm speaking again, which covers the work of the Economic League and the lists of people that they kept. So it's a constant thing. I mean, somewhere people can look around, somebody's shoes are unnecessarily polished in this room. There may be a special person here present. And I apologise to somebody who just helped them to clean their shoes.
I think it's true to say that in the pre-Thatcher era, the nasties were tended to be outside the Tory party. So you've got these organisations like the Economic League who, to a certain extent, like to distance themselves from the Tories, and the Tories likewise. I mean, this was the era of consensus, based on Lutzkerism and Harold Mac Wilson. So these people are possibly more conspicuous because they were trying to drum up causes and say, oh, drum up their trade and say, oh, the Tories don't take any notice of the way that the country is going to dogs with all these unofficial strikes and all the rest of it. To a certain extent, they were true. They were wrong. And Thatcher came in, she got all these people on board, and they made short work of that cause.
We're not quite.
I didn't mean the country was going to dogs. I meant the consensus politicians tended to like to ignore the power of the rank and file in the trade unions.
Yeah, and that's why the beginning of the 1970s, or late 60s and early 70s, are just a time of phenomenal industrial action and phenomenal power of the unions, including the rank and file, which is why Thatcher had to smash the miners and the trade union movement.
I can't believe you can call it the phenomenal power of the unions. I was in the NUT, and at least 2 teachers were not allowed to work for a whole year on full pay because the NUT leadership said they were extremists. Well, they did manifest technically, that's true. But I mean, how on earth you can talk about phenomenal power unless you're talking about the NUT leadership oppressed the ordinary rank and file teacher, which of course it did.
I mean, relatively, if you think, for example, 1970 to 71, there were 25 million working days lost in strikes.
Good.
So good, yes, good. That's absolutely right. It's good.
I mean, everybody had genuine reasons, and there was study of forward workers and the horrendous working conditions that they had.
Yeah, so it's just what I'm saying is, in the late 70s, the balance of power between labour and capital was relatively, it was better for the working class in that period than it was later when we were decimated.
Can I just say something? And earlier, and it was better than earlier because there was a big strike at the Singer sewing machine factory on Clydebank in 1910, I think it was. And there were 10,000 workers employed there, and it was 100% organised by a very militant syndicalist union. And there were 400 strikers were victimised and were never allowed back to work. And in 1963, January 1963, 45,000 workers came out at Fords and Dagenham, and the redundancies, the victimisations were only 9. So that's shows you. I think that's a fair comparison. I don't sound too much like Labour Research Department with the statistics.
It's also reflected in gains in terms of real wages. It was almost as good as it got in the mid-70s. In terms of inequality in society, that was a kind of a high point. Obviously depleted over the Thatcher years quite substantially.
Yes, and worse.
And worse today. Okay, I don't think... Just a round of applause for... Mandy Gorgut is in the room at the moment, so but we've got another 10 minutes, so perhaps people would like to have a bit of a coffee break, and then we'll carry on with the discussion at 3 o'clock with the land of cocaine.
I've got a lovely chance.